So I just started a new playthrough in order to record footage for a video I'm working on. Don't worry, Settlement Builds for Noobs isn't going anywhere. But I barely made it out the door on my way to Vault 111 when I realized something. There is something very wrong with Sanctuary Hills. As I ran around collecting footage of both pre-war and post-war Sanctuary, I couldn't help but notice that certain things just don't add up in the Fallout 4 timeline, especially when we look at Codsworth's story and pay close attention to his behavior and the current state of Sanctuary. Let's start with the story we're all told or expected to think about Sanctuary Hills. Sanctuary Hills is a small suburban cul-de-sac whose only entrance is the North Bridge, the site most historians believe to be the site of the shot heard around the world, marking the start of the American Revolution. The bridge is more or less where you would expect it to be, other than the fact that it has inexplicably changed orientation from east-northeast to southwest, and the area has somehow become an island even though that's not what it currently looks like today. But I'm not here to nitpick geographic inaccuracies, I'm here to take a look at this situation as we find it in-game. As we play our way through the opening chapters of the game, we don't really have much reason to be suspicious at first. We lived in the Sanctuary cul-de-sac in relative happiness up until the day the bombs fell. After emerging from Vault 111, most players will run directly to their house and find our trusty Mr. Handy Codsworth, still active and working to maintain our home. Codsworth is elated to see us and confides that he's been overcome with grief and loneliness as he spent centuries tending to the grounds of our old property. Remember what I just said because it will become important later on. Codsworth admits that he hasn't seen anyone else and that it's a long shot, but suggests that they help you check the surrounding buildings for the whereabouts of Sean's kidnappers. As we clear out bug infestations in the houses of our former neighbors, we can notice several of the houses have collapsed, and the ones that are still standing are understandably in disarray as they have presumably been left abandoned since the day the bombs fell. But one house in particular stands out from the others as the inside has been apparently fortified in some sort of last stand, as cinder blocks, furniture, barrels, and even bathroom fixtures have been piled into a makeshift defensive structure in the middle of the house's living room. You might not think much of this as paranoid neighbors had secret root cellars in the neighborhood, but this is different. This is inside the house. This would have gained the immediate attention of anyone who passed by to see this massive junk piled in the middle of someone's living room. So we're left with the obvious conclusion that this was a post-war construction, but if that's the case, who fortified this house? And what were they defending themselves against? We don't have long to meditate on these questions, however, as we are searching for our son, and once the entire neighborhood has been explored with no signs of Sean or his abductors, we head off to Concord. As Codsworth says, there are people there who don't always shoot at him. By now, you all know what happens there, so let's just fast forward to our return to Sanctuary with the Minutemen survivors. You're tasked with rebuilding Sanctuary and now have more of a reason to explore the entire neighborhood. As we begin to clear the buildings that are no longer standing, we notice that there's something unusual about the ones that are collapsed. In a settlement like this, it's reasonable to assume that it was constructed the same as virtually every other suburb in America, very quickly by the same contractor using materials sourced from the same locations. One of the main attractions to living in a suburb is the simple fact that the houses are all virtually identical in terms of age, quality, and size. And as we are running for our lives in the final seconds before the Boston bomb fell, it's quite apparent that yes, all of these buildings use similar floor plans, are of a similar style, and are constructed of the same materials, and all appear to be roughly the same age. So far, so kosher. So it would stand to reason then that the houses that were destroyed would have to have been exposed to more of the nuclear shockwave than the ones that survived. So we should expect the houses on the high ground or the south side of the neighborhood to be the ones destroyed, while the others could have been somewhat shielded by the blast. But that's not what we see at Sanctuary Hills. 2 of the 4 collapsed houses would have been shielded by others in the settlement, and the houses that would have been most likely to have been destroyed, like the workshop house, as it stands on a hilltop and is directly exposed to the south, is one of the most intact in the entire settlement. Besides, that's not really how nuclear blasts work as they move over open ground. Either the shockwave is still strong enough to demolish everything, or it's sufficiently dissipated that it won't. Given that all of the houses were of the same age and quality, either the entire settlement would have been destroyed or it would have survived. There really is no middle ground here. It stands to reason then that Sanctuary would have actually been a fairly habitable area for anyone who managed to wait out the most extreme radioactive periods. Another smoking gun comes from an unlikely source, the community park on the riverbank. As we look for a good place to begin planting crops, we discover behind the workshop house a nice open hillside. On this hillside, we find the remains of a playground. This was a family community, there were kids living here before the war, so it makes sense that there would have been a playground here. Except there wasn't. You see, in pre-war Sanctuary, it takes a bit of jumping, but you can actually get a pretty good look at this park back in its heyday. But alas, this was a nature park, not a playground. There were no swing sets, monkey bars, picnic tables, or whatever you call this thing that hurts your nuts when you take the wrong step. But an interesting thing is that there is a playground nearby in Concord. The playground contains the same style of picnic tables, though much more damaged than the ones in Sanctuary, the same swing sets, the same monkey bars, and some equipment which may have been too heavy or too damaged to bother moving. So it makes sense if there was a post-war population in Sanctuary, they could have very realistically disassembled the more intact playground equipment and relocated it in Sanctuary. But if there was a thriving community that was prosperous enough that they could devote time, resources, and energy into the relocation of a playground, where did they go? Well, the answers may lie in the remaining home that was hastily fortified and why some of the houses are no longer standing. You see, just on the banks of the Concord River, we can see the same debris that litters the perimeters of the collapsed houses. This isn't that out of the ordinary, except for the river runs along the east and south edges of the neighborhood. If the houses had collapsed from the nuclear blast, all of the debris would have been directed away to the north. Additionally, this debris appears all over Sanctuary, not just to the north of collapsed houses. Perhaps it's simply from the houses that collapsed after the war. I mean, it has been 200 years and stuff rusts and decays with age. Well, you are correct, and frankly, it's a miracle that half the stuff you find in the waste is still intact instead of rusted and rotted away. But there is a small problem with that theory as well. Houses that collapse tend to create a lot of kinetic energy, which could result in debris flung away from the structure, but the vast majority of this is actually directed vertically for the most part. Any debris would just land back on top of the pile or very close to where the structure originally stood. Definitely not down the street or several hundred yards away in the river. But explosives could account for the wide dispersal of debris and the premature collapse of these houses as well. The single best explanation for what happened to this post-war society that resettled Sanctuary Hills after the war is that they were attacked by enemies that possessed high explosive weapons like missile launchers, Fat Mans, nuke grenades, or similarly devastating ordnance. So there, Gray, you did it. You discovered that people that liked playgrounds got blown up. Big whoop. But if they lived here long enough to begin rebuilding, why didn't Codsworth have any memory of them? Remember how I said Codsworth was overcome with grief from not being able to enter the vault with the sole survivor's family and was driven insane from centuries of loneliness? Well, doesn't that sort of strike you as strange for a pre-war domestic robot to have that level of programming sophistication? Even the most advanced pre-war supercomputers like the Zax machines and PAM did not possess the ability to experience or express even basic emotions, no less complicated ones like grief and loneliness. Kiri was a Miss Nanny that experienced very similar isolation and loss to Codsworth and had a highly developed and modified operating system and personality matrix. But unlike Codsworth, she did not experience emotion and recognized that there were inherent limitations in being a robot which prevented her from continuing to develop intuition and emotion. After being transferred into a synth's body, Kiri experienced constant confusion, distraction, and frustration as she attempted to cope with the emotions that she was now feeling for the first time. So how is it that Codsworth, a basic, unmodified Mr. Handy, is capable of not only experiencing emotion but recognizing it and expressing it both consciously and unconsciously? Well, maybe there was a group of post-war settlers who found the area, settled there, and established a relationship with Codsworth. If any of them had an aptitude for tinkering, hacking, or experience with robotics, then it stands to reason that Codsworth may have been tampered with post-war. Any of the nearby vaults, barring Vault 81, could be good candidates, for example. Vault 95 consisted of many recovering addicts, and addicts often will explore self-improvement as a way of redirecting energy and keeping their minds busy. So it also stands to reason that one of them could have dabbled in artificial intelligence or robotics. If anyone made it out of Vault 95, which is possible but not likely given its proximity to the glowing sea, then they may have been able to make it to Sanctuary. Vault 75 experienced a successful rebellion, and nothing is known about where the survivors went after they left the vault, but they would have been well educated and intelligent, and any of them could have very well also had a decent knowledge of computer systems, robotics, or mechanics in general. Of course, the security officers in Vault 111 revolted and left the vault against orders, and any of them very well could have also had a decent knowledge of computer systems, robotics, or mechanics in general, as well as defensive planning to account for things like the fortified house. The very close proximity of Vault 111 to Sanctuary makes this option most likely, as they would have also been familiar with the Concord area to know of things like the playground. But why then does Codsworth claim he's been alone for 210 years? Well, there are two possibilities that come to mind. One is that he truly is insane from grief and loneliness. First, from losing the sole survivor's family in the Great War, then again when his new post-war family were wiped out by unknown attackers. The loss of his second family may have caused him to delete his bad memories and to keep the good ones, which is why he continued to tend the grounds of his original owner's home, certain that they would one day return for him. Another possibility is that Codsworth is actually trying to spare your feelings. He knows that you are still alive after 210 years, so you likely were the result of an experiment he doesn't understand. But he also quickly learns of your spouse's death and son's kidnapping, so Codsworth is in effect the closest thing to family that you have left in this world. His refusal to acknowledge a second sanctuary settlement could be his way of shielding you from the thought that he had once found a new family and wasn't always the ever-loyal family butler that we all know and love. Perhaps there is another reason that requires further investigation, or the evidence has simply just been lost to the sands of time. But whatever the reason, only Codsworth knows, and Codsworth isn't talking. Okay, if Nate is actually watching, I'm sorry I just ripped off your sign-off line, but this is the first time I've done one of these investigation videos, okay? I mean, who is Nate? I've never heard of a YouTube channel that does Fallout 4 and Skyrim investigation videos. It's better if you guys don't go looking. He or she has enough subs or views already if it does exist. Anyway, I'm interested in hearing what you all think. Let's hear your theories in the comments below. And with all that, I'm Gray, you're watching Gray Gaming. Until next time, stay safe and don't trust Codsworth.